Palestinian Chicago community leader Rasmea Odeh was convicted this week in a Detroit court for an immigration law offense, all resulting from a conviction she received over 40 years ago in an Israeli military court. She has so far been denied bail and was put in prison awaiting sentencing. Wednesday there was a demonstration in Chicago and in other cities. We'll be talking again about the case with Jess Sundin. She is a member of the Rasmea Odeh Defense Committee. Sundin is an anti-war activist in Minneapolis and was one of the people raided by the FBI in 2010. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Stan.
So you're back in Minneapolis. What have you heard about the demonstrations that have occurred?
Well, people around the country have been, outraged not only with the verdict, but the decision of Judge Drain to take Rasmea into custody on the last day of the trial. So we've had demonstrations taking place from Monday night in cities like Minneapolis, where I'm from, to Chicago, Rasmea's hometown. Yesterday there were a couple hundred people, and I believe it was actually Wednesday morning, a big demonstration where activists in Oakland locked down to their federal building there. So we've had demonstrations across the country. Today, which is Friday, there's actually a demonstration this afternoon in New York, and on a lot of campuses as well. Students for Justice in Palestine are organizing demonstrations there. So what we're seeing is across the country, people are expressing directly their dissatisfaction with the decision of the so-called justice system this week.
So we interviewed you about during the start of the trial. Can you tell us about the last day and what it was like at the announcement Monday?
Sure. When you say the last day, do you mean the day that the verdict came, or also the last day of testimony?
Well, the last day of the trial. I can't
remember what day we talked.
Yeah, it was Thursday we talked.
Sure. Well, on Friday, Rasmea continued her testimony and then was cross-examined by prosecutor Jonathan Tuckle. And, I think everyone in the courtroom was really holding their breath to see how that would go. But Rasmea is one of the strongest people I've ever seen, and, at Jonathan Tuckle's approach to the cross-examination was to try to, lob a barrage of questions at her one after another, high speed, almost to try to trick her into misspeaking, and he absolutely failed. Rasmea said the same thing again and again, explaining that in the immigration process, she misunderstood forms in one case, and in another case, it was her brother that helped her with her first form. And finally, she said unequivocally that at her interview, which she's the only person that testified in the trial who remembered the interview for her citizenship, that she wasn't asked about convictions outside the United States. So, first of all, Rasmea was absolutely consistent and clear. And second of all, she also, I think, was very compelling, even though her hands were really tied by a judge who had ordered her not to speak at all about her past, her experience being tortured and imprisoned in Israel, or even the context of being a Palestinian in occupied territory. And so, like I said, I think Rasmea held up strong and with grace, and was very clear and consistent in her presentation. Mm-hmm. That said, Jonathan Tuckle took every chance to plant in the minds of the jury, the idea that Rasmea Odeh was trying to trick her way into this country. And the fact is, and I think if it was an unbiased jury, it would have come out a different way, Rasmea was well known as a political prisoner. And she had no reason to imagine the U.S. government was unaware of the events that had transpired that led to her conviction in Israel. And in fact, we know that the State Department became directly involved in her case because her father at the time was a U.S. citizen and had been arrested with her. And so what we saw the last day of the trial very emotional but very powerful. And even so, I think I'm not alone when I say we were quite troubled at the very end of the day, after her testimony and after closing statements by both her defense attorneys and the prosecutor. There were about 20 minutes left before the 1 o'clock break time, and the judge sent the jury back to deliberate. And I think everyone was kind of holding their breath. I remember feeling almost sick to my stomach. And before he sent them back, he said, and if you don't reach a verdict today, in the next 20 minutes, you'll have to come back Monday, and you'll be here all day, and Tuesday's a holiday, so if you don't finish Monday, you'll have to come back Wednesday. Almost like he was holding them hostage, trying to pressure them to make a fast decision. In the end, they didn't make a decision on Friday, so we came back Monday. A whole bus full came again from Chicago of people that Rasmea has worked with in the Arab community, especially Palestinian community. And starting at 8 o'clock, we gathered in front of the courthouse again, as we had done every day during the trial, and waited for the jury's verdict. In the end, it came after just 2 hours deliberation at 11 o'clock. We all filed into the courtroom to hear what they decided. Before the jury came in, the judge was very stern with all of Rasmea's supporters, telling us that if anyone made any comment or had any expression of their feelings based on whatever the outcome was, that they'd be thrown out and they could be held in contempt or worse. Kind of, I think, trying to intimidate people. Nonetheless, we were absolutely disciplined, and even though very upset, listened quietly to the jury's verdict of guilty. And at that point, the prosecution stood up and said, Tuckle stood up and said that he wanted Rasmea's bail revoked so that she could be taken back into custody that day. This was...
Were you surprised at that?
It seemed just vindictive at the time. It wasn't that surprising that he had conducted himself in a, very spiteful, sort of inhuman way throughout the prosecution. That said, the judge said he would consider it and hear arguments at 2 o'clock. So we went outside and we had a little rally. Some people went for lunch or coffee, and we came back at 2. And I don't think, even though we all knew that it was certainly a possibility, it's possible for Rasmea to be taken into custody, even her own lawyers never imagined that would actually happen. But what did happen is first, Tuckle presented his views about why she should be imprisoned that day, namely that she was a flight risk. As evidence of how she was a flight risk, he described that he had watched a YouTube video of her outside earlier that day after the verdict, saying she thought the verdict was unjust, that showed she didn't respect the court. Naturally, Rasmea's defense attorney objected to the idea of referencing YouTube and not actually bringing it into evidence anyway. And, he also, and then her defense attorney was able to present his views, which were she's absolutely not a flight risk and has tremendous deep ties in the community in Chicago where she comes from, and that, in fact...
How old is she?
Rasmea is 67.
Yeah.
And this case came before Judge Jane's court after Rasmea had rejected a plea agreement where she could have been removed from the country without being risking prosecution, risking arrest and imprisonment. So Rasmea, and her attorney said this, was actually in court this week because she wants to stay here. So the idea that she might flee is outrageous. But the judge didn't see it the same way, and he talked about how, first of all, Rasmea didn't have deep community ties. He talked about how her father and brother, who she originally came to the U.S. to be with, had died, so she had no family in the country, which is not true. Her 2 nephews were with her throughout the trial, and both live in Chicago. I understand she also has cousins in Chicago. He said that her ties to the community, through her work with the Arab Women's Committee was insubstantial, and that in fact she could go anywhere and do that same kind of work, and so it didn't represent real ties to the community. And then he said, moreover, that he offered as evidence of her likelihood that she would flee during the trial. It was presented that one of Rasmea's arrests in Israel was after an attempted escape from an Israeli prison. And I think all of us were very shocked to hear that presented, given that the judge certainly knew that Rasmea was tortured in those prisons and by those Israeli authorities. And the idea that someone would flee, try to escape prison 40 years ago in conditions of torture could be held against them, presenting them as a flight risk today in this country, was so offensive. And finally, at some point, he said, as further evidence that, Rasmea didn't really respect the court, he sort of wagged his head back and forth and said, no matter what you wanted to say about your rape and your torture and whatever happened in Israel, like dismissing it all in one fell swoop, saying that she hadn't respected the court because she had, at certain points it had come in small bits out to the jury, some of what had happened to her. So then the court judge decided that she should be taken into custody right away, and in front of all of her loved ones and her supporters from across the country, and especially Chicago. 2 large U.S. Marshals came behind her, put her into handcuffs, and took her away.
When is sentencing expected?
March 10th.
March 10th of next year, wow. And what is a possible sentence before the deportation?
So in the arguments on Monday, it became clear that the prosecution intends to seek imprisonment here first. There was a reference to another case where 21 months was the sentence, and so she could face 21 months imprisonment in the United States before she faces the loss of her citizenship and then removal from the country or deportation.
Deportation to where?
That isn't entirely clear, but the last country that she lived in and held citizenship in before she came to the U.S. was Jordan. So presumably it would be Jordan, but that hasn't really been discussed.
Now, what can people do at this stage? Can one write to the judge about clemency or bail? Would that help?
We are asking people to write to the judge about bail or about bonding, about her being released prior to sentencing. And they can do that by what we're asking people to do. You can check at stopfbi.net. We've got sort of some guidelines or suggested letter that you can copy and add some of your own text to. Or if you just want to freehand it, you can send it to us at justice4Rasmea at uspcn.org. And we're sending those off either from individuals or organizations as soon as they come in, urging Judge Drain to have her released immediately. Her attorneys have already filed a motion asking him to reconsider his decision, and hopefully he will respond both to the strong legal arguments that her lawyers are presenting and to the, outpouring of concern from the community around the country. The other thing people can do is, write to Rasmea herself. Again, also at stopfbi.net. Her address is online, and while she's there, it's good for her to hear from people who support her, that we continue to stand with her. As for the sentencing itself, I think we'll at a later date be asking people to write about that. We don't have a specific set of requests related to that. Our most urgent wish is to get Rasmea back home to Chicago as soon as possible for now.
Now, what about the media? I know Democracy Now! Had a story before the trial, but I'm kind of surprised there was no coverage, except a mention of the conviction, no real coverage since the trial.
There has been some coverage, but, the fact is that Rasmea's story is not really consistent with what the mainstream media wants us to understand about the U.S. government and its relationship to Israel and Israel's relationship to Palestinians. The fact is that you can't tell the story of her conviction without acknowledging that she was tortured by Israel and that she was a political prisoner. And the reality is that Judge Drainman did everything he could to make sure that record wasn't brought into his courtroom. And I think the media was really continuing that effort to silence the Palestinian struggle and the complicity of the United States in that. And so, any places that you didn't see Rasmea's story told or told in full, I think it was sort of a continuation of what Palestinian and Palestine solidarity activists have seen for years, especially including this last summer, an effort to sort of hide the crimes of Israel against the Palestinian people.
Well, I'm going to encourage people to write to stories@democracynow.org. I mean, this is not that's not a mainstream.
Sure.
And usually they have great coverage about Palestine, and they're kind of falling down here, and when they need a nudge. What about Attorney General Holder? The media now is talking about his legacy, blah, blah, blah. Does he have any responsibility in this case, or in the raids that took place in Chicago and Minneapolis and, several years ago?
Yeah, absolutely he does. We know that the investigation of Rasmea grew out of the investigation of myself and other Palestine solidarity and Palestinian activists in the Midwest. And that investigation was absolutely under the authority and with the knowledge of Attorney General Eric Holder. And I don't just say that rhetorically. The fact is, after the raids, he was directly confronted here in Minneapolis by one of the other folks who was raided by the FBI in September of 2010. He absolutely had knowledge of that investigation and the raids, and it's under his authority that was carried out, that the grand jury was conducted in Chicago, and it's under his authority that the investigation hasn't been closed, but instead has been used as a fishing expedition to find others who are around us who, if you go back 45 years, maybe you can find something to bring a new prosecution for them, as they've done in the case of Rasmea and as they did with Carlos Montes.
Let me get that straight. The investigation of you 4 years ago hasn't been closed yet?
No, it has not. In fact, when asked directly, the prosecutor in Chicago has specifically said that he has until, I think he says 2018, and that the investigation is not closed.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for talking with us.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on.
This has been Stanley Heller talking to Jess Sundin about the Rasmea Odeh case. Thank you all for listening.